Welcome to The Human Experience, a podcast about the stories we live out every day and the importance of championing the vulnerability and courage of the storyteller. I'm your host, Jennifer Peterkin, and it was through my own lived story of experiencing domestic violence that this podcast was created. By traveling the globe and interviewing each guest in person, I am convinced now more than ever that stories have the power to change the world. You can join our community of storytellers by subscribing, leaving a rating and review, signing up for my newsletter, following me on Instagram, and more. Thank you for being here. In a world full of noise, to listen with intention is an act of resistance.
All right, Robert, thank you so much for meeting with me today. We are sitting in your office, and I have so many questions for you, but this is about your story from your perspective. And I know a little bit about some of the things that you've done, but I want to know what that means to you, what your story means to you. So we are at the Stonewall National Museum and Archives
and Library.
And library. Okay. And you are the founder?
No.
Okay.
The organization is 52 years old.
Okay.
And although I'm old, but no, I've only been here for 3 years.
Oh, okay.
And the library was started 52 years ago in Hollywood, Florida, by a 17-year-old.
Wow.
And he was inspired by the Stonewall uprisings, which took place in New York. Mm-hmm. And when he went to college locally, he met someone who had started a small archive. And so they pooled their resources and they became the Stonewall Library and Archive. And then they quickly realized that college kids can't do that and go to college. So they found what we would call grown-ups who lived in Fort Lauderdale. And the Library and Archive moved to Fort Lauderdale and has been growing ever since.
Wow. That's very cool. Yeah, I really have no idea of the history of the museum and archives and library itself. So that's super interesting. I'm trying to think of myself at 17, and I was quite ambitious, but I don't think I would have been that ambitious. That's pretty impressive.
Yeah, creating a lending library for the LGBTQ community in Hollywood, Florida, in your parents' house back in 1973 is probably not the thing that most people were thinking of.
Quite a legacy, for sure. So you came here 3 years ago.
Yes.
But you have quite a background beyond that, and it all seems to center around human rights activism. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Largely, even before I knew what that was, I was already doing that work.
Before it was a buzz phrase.
Well, way before it was a buzz phrase. But before I heard the word activist attached to it, it was work that I was doing because I was raised that you always have to give back more. You have to try at least to leave the world better than you found it. And so that has colored everything that I have done, or almost everything that I've done. And it makes life complicated.
Sure.
It makes life very complicated.
So you said you were raised to believe that you always had to leave the world better than you came into it, essentially. So why was that the principle that stuck with you?
Well, my parents felt that they were very lucky. Neither of them were raised wealthy, and they ended up being moderately successful, certainly not grandly successful, but the reason that they both felt successful was because of the work that they did that was giving back. The work that they did that made money was not nearly as rewarding as the other things that they did. And so that was instilled, at least in me, that to find the inner happiness that we all seek, because that makes life worth living and makes life enjoyable, came from the things that they did that made other people's lives better.
Yeah.
And so being raised and witnessing that, they didn't even have to say anything. I mean, it just became clear and obvious that was a pathway to finding something good within yourself, which made everyday life far better than it would otherwise be.
Yeah, that's pretty impressive, I think, for people to leave that sort of legacy, so much so that it wasn't words that you heard, but it was things that you watched your parents live out every single day, and it had such a profound effect. I just think that's pretty incredible for anybody to do. And so absolutely kudos to your parents for, being who they were and instilling that in you, and not making it something that you were pressured into or you felt a weight or a burden about it, but just that it was the key to success in life was to do for others. I think that's a pretty incredible lesson to learn early on.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I'll never forgive them for setting that example. But at the same time, it has allowed me to be in interesting places at interesting times and meet amazing people all over the world. And for that, I'm very grateful.
Yeah.
I do wish that it made more money.
Sure.
Which it does not do. But the stories and the life experience are unusual. And that has given me a very different eye on the world.
Yeah. Yeah. Where did you grow up?
In New York.
Oh, okay.
The New York metropolitan area.
And what did your parents do?
My father's job was selling supermarket equipment.
Okay.
Mostly shopping carts.
Oh, interesting.
And yes. And my mother was a psychologist.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Or, yes, was now.
And what was your first memory of realizing what it was to give back or to serve others?
The one that I remember most was when Martin Luther King was assassinated. You're way too young to remember that, but I still do. And that was 1968. And I was transfixed by the television when that happened and them showing him on the balcony and getting shot and all of that. And what sort of shocked me is how little I knew about Martin Luther King Jr. Now it seems that we should all know. But back then, our worlds were very segregated.
Yeah.
And so I went to my mother and I said, this is terrible and what's going on? And she put me in the car and we drove to the community that was right next to ours. And she brought me into this building, and in there was this woman named Ruth Ransom. And Ruth Ransom was a Black woman, and she ran an organization called the Open Door Society or the Open Door Center. And it was small. And my mother dropped me there and then walked out.
Oh, okay.
And Ruth Ransom said, so you're here to help. And I said, okay. And she said, what we need you to do is to help us raise money so that we can offer the children that live in this neighborhood an escape for at least 1, 2, or 3 weeks over the summer. So they get to see what it's like to be free. And so I went back to my elementary school because I was young, and I organized kids in my elementary school, and we decided to have a hobby fair where everybody could display their hobbies and sell things. And I went store to store to get things that we could auction off or raffle off. And I was kicked out of stores.
Wow.
Called an end lover. And I didn't even know what those things were. And I had white hair, so blonde that it was white, and I have blue eyes. And I was shocked that I was getting thrown out of places. So I started to imagine what it would be like for the kids that I was now working for. And those were discussions that I had with Ruth Ransom. And I started to really get a feel for what it was like to not live where I lived, but to be the outsider. And so those things became fascinating for me. And we ended up doing this. And this was 1968. And we raised over $5,000, which back then was money.
Yes. I'm sorry, but if you're in elementary school, at any point in time raising over $5,000, I'm thinking of my nieces raising $5,000 in elementary school. That's a big deal.
Right. But in those days,
Sure.
you could buy a car.
Sure. Yes.
I mean, it was, and so we sent a lot of kids to camp.
Amazing.
And that was the first experience. And it was a rewarding experience. And although I experienced hate and some discomfort, which I didn't completely understand at that age, it helped me in everything else that I've done, where I've had guns pointed at me and other kinds of things, which were far more threatening than somebody calling me names.
Yeah. But that was the first.
That's the first that I truly remember as something that I did, that I organized, that I made happen.
I think it's really interesting to think about, you talk to your mom about it, and I'm not a mom, so I can't say, but I think about how many times children talk to their parents, right? And they express themselves, they express their emotions and how they're feeling, and how much of it is not for any reason, any bad reason, but how much of it is kind of just like, okay, like, yeah, I understand that you're feeling that. That's so sad, but like, you can't really do anything about it. And because you're small. And your mom was like, nope, we're going to visit Ruth, and, you're going to see what it's like. If you really want to make a difference, you have the capability to do so. But there was no like emotional protection. And again, I don't mean that in a bad way, but there was no like, oh, I'm going to keep him from this, from the ugliness of it.
No, my mother was involved as long as I could remember in the League of Women Voters. So she was confronted with losing elections and all of those kinds of things for as long as I can remember. And so, no, there was definitely no pretense, no fears, she didn't put anything on me that would make it seem that it wasn't something that was doable.
Yeah.
And that it was the right thing to do. And then, of course, I watched everything about Martin Luther King Jr., and I learned more of that story. And then I became fascinated with the history of the civil rights movement. And then I became fascinated with the traditions of slavery in this country and the Constitution and all of that. And so it really was a rabbit hole for me that I still am fascinated by. And I understand, in a way, why we are where we are today.
Sure.
Because the same battles are being fought literally on a daily basis.
Right. Yeah. Because in a lot of ways, this is all very much by design.
Everything is by design.
Yeah.
What's not by design is the fact that we don't learn from these experiences. The fact that we are still fighting the Civil War, that we're even talking about people who would like to bring us back to 1850, is because we're not learning. We don't understand history. We don't understand what history is. So you can't learn something if you don't even know what it is. And history is unique in the sense that I like to describe history as a fabric, a very, very dense fabric with lots and lots of threads, trillions of threads. Everybody, everything that has ever lived on the planet is a thread. And each one of those threads is a story. And that's history. Now, you can't learn it all at once because it's such a big piece of rug. But when you start removing those threads, you're no longer learning history. Now it's selective. Now it's biography, but it's not history. Because to know the history, you have to know how they interrelate with one another, how they hold together, how they impacted each other. So one of the things that I like to remind people of is many people have heard of John Adams. John Adams was George Washington's vice president for 8 years. the second president of the United States for 4 years. But in those days, those people didn't really get paid. John Adams was from Massachusetts. He was the first president to be in the White House. How did he pay for it? How did he buy his food? Well, that's because there was an Abigail Adams, who happened to be John's wife and the mother of his children, who lived in Braintree, Massachusetts, where she ran the farm and took care of the kids and made the money so that John Adams could be John Adams.
Wow.
And if you don't know that story, you think John Adams did it all by himself. And nobody does it all by themselves.
Right.
And George Washington. Now, when he became the general of the army for the Revolution, he did it for free, which means that George Washington had to have money from somewhere. Well, he wasn't poor. He was a landowner. He was a slave owner, but he wasn't overly wealthy. But Martha Washington was.
Yeah.
And so here we are at the beginning of our country in 1776 going forward, and the first two presidents had wealthier wives or wives that were able to make an income, make a living. And that's not shared in our history books because the biography of those great men was what was important. So if that's how we're learning history, we're not learning the history.
Yeah.
And because of that, we're building a national story on clay feet. And it's not sustainable. And it makes us think that what they said and what they did might be more important than other things, when in reality, we're not even knowing them. And we don't really know what they thought unless we read those letters. So the letters between Abigail and John, which have been published and people should look at, show what the relationship was and what she did and how she did it and how much separation there was. She was in Massachusetts. He was in France and in England. She was in Massachusetts. He was in Washington or Philadelphia. That's tough for any relationship.
Sure.
But when you're the father of a new country, a founder, it's very difficult because you're growing in different ways, and yet you have to find a way to hold it together in order to survive in a complicated world. So that's what all of this has done for me. It's made me look at these things vastly differently than the biographies I read or the histories I read, because they don't give you that story. Who was working on that farm? Who was working on the plantations that were owned by George and Martha Washington that made it possible for them to succeed? You know, we just don't know all of the story, so we don't know the story of America. We don't know the story of the people who founded it. We don't know why they made the decisions that they did unless we really start to dig much deeper. And then we understand why the Constitution was made up of so many compromises, because they needed these people to sign on, and they knew that they were compromises, and they knew that they were wrong. And yet we still live with them as if they were set in stone by God.
Yeah.
And they were meant to be corrected. And yet what happens is the people in power are in power because of the way those compromises were established. And they don't want to lose that power. They don't want to lose that wealth. They don't want to lose those contacts. They want to make themselves important. I remember as a kid going into houses that were near our house, and the only book that was on display was the Social Register, which is a book that contains the names and the lineage of those who came over on the Mayflower.
Oh, wow.
It's not a thin book anymore. It's many generations since the Mayflower. But that was what they were proud of, is that their lineage were the first people to come here and establish that foothold in New England. Okay?
Yeah.
But that's a very small fraction of what America is supposed to be about, but that's where those people still live. And that's extraordinary. And why? And what have they done? And where did they go? And what did they do? And all of those things are what make this country what it is, but we don't know them. How many people have seen the social register? How many people have run through and seen how many of their neighbors are in the social register and knowing you'll never be in the social register?
Sure. Yeah. Wow.
So history is an amazing thing, but history looked at in its complexities and its totality is far more interesting than what we're exposed to.
Oh, I agree. And I feel like in a lot of ways, it's something that I have just started to dip my toe into, right? And it's been years, but it's still, there's so many nuances to humanity. And there's always, as many people are involved in something, there's that many sides of a story or a perspective. So it's a lot. It's a dedication. It's a discipline to learn history in as complete a form as you possibly can, to try to honor all of those involved in what came before. Was that something that you picked up along the way naturally, or did you specifically want to study history?
It was natural. Yeah. It was just the interest in why and how and who.
Yeah.
And when those things collide, the inquisitiveness, the interest, the why are we living like this? Why? I mean, I remember, I was really young, and I was watching a Disney movie on a black and white TV screen, and it was about cowboys and Indians. I don't remember the name of the movie. I don't know if it was for TV or for a film. And I said, okay, that's what I want to be when I grow up, an Indian.
Oh, interesting.
And my mother said, you can't do that. They're a people.
Yeah.
You have to be born into that. And I was devastated that I couldn't just say I'm now an Indian.
Yeah.
And so that was another learning experience, that you can't be certain things, but you can learn about them.
Yeah.
And you can figure out why. So I was always surprised when I found out that other people don't like other people, that people were prejudiced, that people held longstanding hate towards other groups. And for me, even today, I don't fully understand it. I mean, I can get a sense of why, but that's because of the historic record and because of where people came from. We came from Africa as these small creatures that were more worried about surviving the night because there were saber-toothed tigers and other animals out there that we would make a nice meal for. And we lived in caves and we lived in trees and we lived in other kinds of hiding places. And as we changed and as we had fire and as we ate meat and as we did this and as we did that, we got bigger and we got stronger. And going from the intimacy of living in a family or a small group, we started to have tribes, and then we started to have villages and communities and got bigger and bigger and knocked all the other humanoids off the planet. But that took hundreds of thousands, millions of years. Neanderthals aren't here anymore. There are other species of humanoids that are not here anymore. And now we wonder how long Homo sapiens will be here. So all of those things play into each other in such interesting ways. But you understand better because if you were this small little tribe, which most likely everybody was related in one way or another, and you knew everyone had to have children so your tribe would grow, because just over that hill was another tribe, and they had 10 more people than you, which means they would win.
Mm-hmm.
So you had to figure out what to do and how to control enough land so that you could get food. Because then you were a hunter-gatherer, you weren't a farmer. So those things make so much more sense as to why we're territorial, why we are still so closely related to other animals and their behaviors, and how few of our own behaviors, when we're really in a stressful situation, are any different than other animals. Because that part of our brain is not so different. And yet, as a species, we've created art, we've created universities, we've created big cities, we've created music. We've done all of these things, which have separated us in a unique way from the rest of the animal kingdom, that have humanized us, that have socialized us, that have created societies in ways that not even bees and ants can do. And yet, our animal instincts, our primeval animal instincts, often come out, and we make enemies, scapegoats of other human beings. We should be beyond that. And so delving into that and seeing where anthropology and sociology and history come together to try and figure out what makes us human and what is the difference between humans that strive for human rights and living in a social and civic community versus humans that are just trying to survive. And I know that when I started this program for the chancellor of the New York City Public Schools, I went in and I said, I want to work with the kids that no one wants to work with. And the chancellor said, well, don't expect any success from that group. And I said, that's fine, but nobody wants to work with them. And so I was given 3 schools initially. And what I discovered in those schools is that even the children, and not all of them only spoke English, some spoke Spanish, some spoke Chinese, but they were poor. It was some of the poorest congressional districts in the United States of America. But what I realized that many of them didn't have a vast skills in language. And so I had a group from Brooklyn, and we went out, and there was this one kid, and his vocabulary was extraordinarily limited. And whenever someone would say something that he probably didn't completely understand, his first response was violence, because he didn't have words. Mm-hmm. And that made him always on edge. And so when we would be in certain situations, I would stand behind him. And we were in one place where they got to work in a kitchen to see what it was like for an entry-level job, because most of these kids didn't know anybody who worked. They didn't know anybody who had a real job. They were really on the streets, a lot of them. And so we would go to places where you could get entry-level work, kitchen work, or custodial work, or those kinds of things. Not because we were pushing them into those kinds of jobs, but just so they knew that the better they did in school, the higher up on that ladder they could start. Sure. So instead of going in and introducing them to executives, which was completely out of their realm, we went in and started with people who had the same amount of education as they did. And then they would say why it was important for them to stay in school, why it was important for them to learn to read and write. And it was much more valuable coming from them than coming from me or coming from their teacher. And so with this kid, we're in a white tablecloth restaurant. They've all just come out of the kitchen where they were preparing food, and now they were sitting at a table with a white tablecloth and knives and forks and napkins, something that some of them have never, ever seen. And someone said something to him, and the first thing he did was grab the knife. And I put my hands on his shoulders, and I could feel his shoulders drop, and the knife went back down, and then everything was okay. But the first response was survival. And I learned an awful lot about people through that program.
Oh, I'm sure. Wow. So what did you actually go to school for?
Well, I started as a drama major.
Did you?
I did. And then I sort of had a disagreement with the head of the department. And I was asked to leave the drama department.
Oh.
Which I was happy to do. And I became a history major. But it was only after 2 years or 2+ years in the theater department.
Did you want to have a career in theater?
Well, I've done my first off-Broadway play. I played a Puerto Rican delivery boy. And Kelsey Grammer, who went on to play Frasier, was the prop manager.
What?
So I was the actor and he was crew.
So success is what I'm hearing.
Well, not for me.
No, that was the success right there.
But then I was writing music and I was performing in nightclubs. So I performed in nightclubs in New York and in Beverly Hills, and just a little. And I did 5 films in California. Well, cast in California.
Okay.
But they were all over.
Now, I know you've done a documentary. So is that counted in that? Or is this? Okay.
The documentary, which I wrote and produced, was done on the Holocaust. And that was shot in Poland. And it was part of a program called March of the Living. And the program brought about 7,000 kids from 25 countries from around the world to Poland to learn about the Holocaust at the camps.
Wow.
So we went to a number of the death camps and the concentration camps, and we recorded the people. And what I wanted was a story that reflected the experiences they were having, not words. So we did it without words, without dialogue. So it started where you saw these kids, and this was the only time when they spoke for the camera, and they said their name and what country they came from. And then we followed these kids through one camp after the next camp and watched what was happening to them as they experienced something that possibly some of their relatives had experienced. And then at the very end, when they were emotionally scarred, in a positive way because it was a learning experience, we had them say their names again, but we showed the pictures of children who had died in the Holocaust. So that notion of being alive and being excited at the beginning and then hearing some of those very same names and knowing that the picture you were seeing was someone who perished. That's how our lives are. Some people have the luck of the draw and others do not. And just by the grace of God, those families left Europe and went to South America or went to wherever, and they survived. And their families made it possible for them to have lives elsewhere.
Yeah.
So it was a very powerful project. And I shot it with a Ukrainian-based crew. And the music was original music written by someone in Moscow. And it was performed by a symphony orchestra.
Wow.
Which back in 1990 was all possible because the Soviet Union hadn't broken up yet.
Right.
So this was all coordinated with the Soviet Union, and we got archival materials from the archives in Moscow. So it was really a very exciting thing to do.
Yeah. How did that come about? I mean, you are like all over the place in the best possible way. The opportunities that you've had and the things that you've pursued. And I know we haven't even, I feel like, scratched the surface, but how did you find yourself moving down these paths?
I met somebody. I became involved in the march. I went on the march. I said it has to be recorded. I started working on what was the 50th commemoration of the Babi Yar massacre. Babi Yar is a place in Ukraine that a yar is the Ukrainian word or the Russian word for ravine.
Okay.
So the name of this ravine was Babi or Baby. And that was where the Nazis did the first mass execution of Jews in World War II.
Oh.
And what they wanted, before that, they created ghettos and encampments and concentration camps, which were not death camps. But they hadn't started the mass execution. And they came into Kyiv, then it was Kiev, part of the Soviet Union, and they rounded up the Jews and they marched them from their homes in the inner city to what was at that time just outside the city in a Jewish cemetery. And there in the cemetery was this ravine. And they made them take off their clothes and put their valuables on tables and give their names because they were very German, the Nazis. And then they lined up everybody, women, children, and men, naked at the ravine edge. And then they mowed them down with machine guns and then pushed the bodies into the ravine. And then the next group. And I think in the first week, they killed 40,000 people.
Oh, my God.
And because people were crying and screaming, they put up speakers and they played dance music. So people that lived nearby wouldn't hear the guns and wouldn't hear the people, but would hear dance music. And to make sure people couldn't escape, the roads were lined with barbed wire, soldiers with machine guns, and German shepherds.
Oh.
So they had no way to escape. The only people who ultimately survived were people who fell into the ravine without being shot and laid there until nightfall and then crawled out. Some were shot, but not dead. And not many people survived because they were naked.
Right.
And Ukraine gets really cold in the winter. So it was very, very difficult. But the German High Command went up there and wanted to see if this was an efficient way of erasing a population. And what they discovered was these very young soldiers who were sitting there with machine guns and Gatling guns were getting drunk because they felt very uncomfortable killing civilians, especially women and children. And so they realized that this was not efficient and they were wasting a lot of bullets. And then back in Berlin, there was what was called the Wannsee Conference, where they discussed the mass execution of the Jewish community. And they started experimenting with other things and they came up with gassing. And so ultimately, Kiev was the first step in the Holocaust. And so back in 1991 was the 50th anniversary, or 50th commemoration. And I produced it for what would then become the Ukrainian government.
Okay.
At that point, they were just a Soviet republic.
Sure. Wow. So you have done a lot of different things. Have you ever had one focus in terms of human rights, in terms of your activism? Because the things that we've talked about have all affected different populations, and obviously there's common themes and threads. And I know history is a huge thing for you, but how has that affected you in terms of being involved in all of these different pockets of despair and oppression? I know it's secondary, obviously. It's not something that you, at least what we've talked about, you experienced firsthand. But I've found that most people kind of pick one thing and they carry it through their entire career. And that doesn't seem to be the case for you. So how is that?
No, they're much smarter than I am. Because if you do that, then you get known for something, and hopefully you build a career. When you go all over the place, you don't make any money. And by the time you go back to ask for help, those people are either dead or gone. So you have to start everything from scratch.
Wow. Yeah.
And so I wouldn't recommend the way I've done it. But like I said, it has put me in interesting places at interesting times. And I've gotten to meet interesting people. So in that regard, it's been fun. But I always feel like I'm on a big plate and I'm sitting at the edge, and everything that's important is happening somewhere in the middle of the plate. And so I always feel a little bit on the outside, working with people that are famous or important. And I'm a facilitator, ultimately. Even when I've planned it, even when I'm executing it, I'm still not the center of attention. I'm trying to help make something happen. And that's okay, but it's not lucrative for sure.
Right. How do you choose? How do you choose what a project that you will be involved in looks like?
Sometimes out of desperation, you just have to do something. And oftentimes because there's nothing that touches people, I feel, that doesn't touch me. And so therefore it becomes interesting just by the nature of other people.
Yeah. Have you experienced burnout?
I know that I have. It doesn't really stop anything.
Yeah.
It just makes my brain hurt.
Yeah.
But with a lot of this stuff, it's not like I'm in competition with a lot of other people.
Sure.
And it has to happen. So you work 7 days a week and you work all day and all night and you get up frightfully early. But so much of it is inspiring because you see the rewards in the faces of those people you're working for.
Yeah. So you ended up getting your history degree. Did you teach? What did you do after school with that?
I didn't do anything with it.
Okay.
I went to Hollywood and I scrounged around trying to get enough money to pay rent.
Okay.
And I did these films and I did my nightclub work.
And is that because you wanted to be in that scene?
I wanted to be there because the people that I respected most that were in that world used their celebrity to talk about important things. And I thought that would be a great way to make money and at the same time have a voice that people would listen to.
Sure.
And while I was there, I was offered a job for an organization that was based in DC. And so I left.
Okay. And what was that?
That was a job that I care not to talk about.
Oh, okay.
Only because the organization from when I worked there to what that organization is now are vastly different. And I really do not respect the work that they do.
Sure.
And although the people that I worked with were completely different and the organization was completely different, and I got to meet extraordinary people that I'm glad that I worked with.
Yeah.
But it was in politics, and the organization has completely transformed. And so it is not something that I am happy about.
Yeah. Totally fair. Totally fair. So after Washington, what was next?
Well, actually, I was in their New York office and commuted back and forth very, very, very often. And then I got another job, really in politics in Washington. And that was short-lived. But once again, I got front row seat with a lot of people who have been in power, are in power, or will be in power.
For better or worse.
It's always for better or worse. And then I left there and started my own consulting business called Irenics, which is a word that means the art of conciliation and peacemaking. So I decided I would take on projects that I believed in, and I worked for nonprofits, and I worked for political candidates or office holders that I believed were worthy of being elected and being in office. And I did that for many years. Then I started this nonprofit that did the school project that I mentioned before at that same time. And then I started a film festival because I recognized how powerful film can be. And by picking films and by picking writers and directors that you want to represent, it can make a difference in people's lives or the way they see the world. And because of the film festival, the University of Connecticut asked me to teach a film and theater course. So I taught 2 courses there, and then I ended up teaching another course in the business school. So I had that going on while I was doing the festival, and I committed to do the festival for 5 years. And then I said, if it doesn't have a life of its own, that's going to be the end.
Yeah.
And so we did it for 5 years. And once again, I got to meet amazing people. I got to do amazing things and really have an impact on the community and learned a lot myself. And then what did I do? I did something.
That I'm sure of.
Oh, then I took another job in Washington for an organization that was called TV Turnoff Week. And then we changed it to Center for Screen Time Awareness because it ended up by then, it's more than TV that has screens, phones and computers and pads, and they all have ultimately the same impact. And I did that for a few years. And then I went back to work with the person who I gave the idea to create the UN Decade for Human Rights Education, and took over that organization for a number of years and traveled all over the world talking about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
Wow. Do you enjoy travel, or did you enjoy travel?
Yeah, I do. And I did, because it's always amazing to, especially the way I was doing it, because I dealt with people at literally all levels of society. So I did that when I was in the Soviet Union as well. I met people who were in theater. I met people who were farmers. I met people who were in government. Most of the people that I met that were foreigners were in one niche, and that's all that they knew. And I was understanding the culture. I mean, I was in the bakery buying my black bread. I was here doing this, doing that. They weren't. And so they would start calling me and say, well, what's going to happen?
Yeah.
Because I was with people and they were not. I became friends with the waiter in the restaurant, at the hotel. I knew the people. I took the buses. So it was, for me, always exciting. In Egypt, I would walk in neighborhoods where they said, you're white, you really shouldn't be here at night. And yet I did. And so part of it is crazy and stupid, not knowing where you are or why you're there. But I learned an awful lot. And so I experienced the Arab Spring in Tahrir Square, which was on the news everywhere.
Yeah.
And I was in Kyiv when the Soviet Union broke up. And I was in all of these different places at absolutely amazing times when history was being made.
Yeah.
Even though I myself was not making the history, I was there in the places where it was happening, surrounded by people who were making it happen. and talking to them and working with them and supporting them in their efforts. So I can't complain about that. One day you're with Barbara Streisand, and then the next day you're with the first president of Ukraine.
Wow.
So it's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
I'm sitting in my office and the phone rings and it's Paul Newman, and the next day it's Gregory Peck, so who called himself Greg, by the way. Hi, this is Greg Peck. Oh.
Oh, okay.
How do you respond to that?
Right? Wow. I think it's so fascinating on a very minuscule level. I can relate to the idea of having all of these opportunities and experiences, and really they're priceless. There's nothing that can replace them. And most human beings don't get to have them, but they don't have any monetary value. And it's not that you need to be rich and famous, but it would be nice to not have to worry about what the next thing is because you're solvent. So I think that it brings a larger conversation of what is success and what does that mean? And, can it mean different things to different people? Which I think, yes. But yeah, would you say that you've led a successful life?
I would say no. Rewarding, yes, but successful. I know this is, I shouldn't even go there, but I think that other people may feel this way as well. That when we're young and we believe that there are no limits, and we see people who we admire and we would like to have the impact that they've had. So when I was a little kid, Kennedy became president. Mm-hmm. That was an amazing figure. Like I said, so Bobby Kennedy was killed in 1968. Martin Luther King was killed in 1968. I remember shaking Bobby Kennedy's hand when I was this little kid, and he was running for the United States Senate in New York. My mother was getting her hair done, and I slipped out of the salon, and they were building this stage in the parking lot of this strip mall. And they were putting up the bunting and all of this, and the car comes in, and it's Bobby Kennedy. I really don't know if I knew who he was. And because I was so little, I got all the way up to the stage, and he literally knelt down and shook my hand.
Wow.
And I remember running back to the salon and telling my mother I would never wash this hand. Of course I did. But I was so thrilled, and I think that had a lot to do ultimately with what I chose to do, because he became this huge figure. Mm-hmm. And that was when he was going into the Senate. He won that election and became a United States Senator. And he was just so amazing. And then, of course, he ran for president. And I was old enough then to understand what was going on. And I'm not that I was old enough to vote, but I was old enough to understand. And he was just amazing. His words were amazing. His presence was amazing. And so I think that had a lot to do with it. So when those influencers touch you, you want to be, you want to achieve what they were able to achieve. And now he was young when he was killed. Martin Luther King was even younger. And so I'm much older than both of them. Probably not combined, but close. And in that respect, I feel like I've done nothing yet. And so I don't feel I've reached a level of success yet. I know that I've had amazing experiences and that I've done things for other people that have made their lives better.
Yeah.
So I don't feel bad about what I've done or how I've done it, but I feel that I've never reached my potential. And that's a frustration, especially when you start to get old.
Do you think that's something that has kept you pursuing all of these years and trying to find that, reaching that potential?
I don't think that I've ever done things ever to reach that potential. Not that I've shied away from them, but I think that those kinds of things happen when you're confronted with extraordinary circumstances and you're the right person at the right time in the right place. And I don't know completely or at all if it's possible to create that.
Sure. I think right place, right time is definitely a big part of that, which is a very interesting, it's an interesting way of looking at humanity in general, and I think stories in general, because what makes a good story? What is something that makes it stand the test of time, other than being in the right place at the right time?
What makes it stand the test of time is how relatable it is. When it touches you deep inside, then it will last forever. And that's why great literature, great films, great music last forever, is because they touch you in a way that nothing else does. And it's the same with the stories of why do people love Helen Keller? Why do people find it fascinating to read the Diary of Anne Frank? Because those stories touch you in a way that is so undeniable that you don't forget them.
Sure. So how did you end up here?
I ended up here because a friend of mine said there was a job opening and you must apply.
Oh.
And I said no. And I said no again and again and again. And this friend was relentless. And so I said, okay, they'll never give it to me. I'm a white male of a certain age. There's no chance. So I'll just apply. And lo and behold, they offered me the job. And the more I thought about it while the process was going on, and it was a very long process, I realized that everything that I had been working on, to some extent, lived potentially in this job. If you raise the boats that hold the people who are scapegoated the most, if you raise the boats of the people that people love to hate, then you're raising, and in a community that represents all the other communities. Because every community is represented in the LGBTQ community.
Yeah.
There's no religion, race, nationality, ethnicity that's not found within this community. So I thought, if I'm able to do something with this organization that raises that level of visibility and acceptance and brings the history and culture of a group of people that often anonymously or with caveats have touched everybody on the planet, then I would be doing the work that I've always been doing and potentially touch them in a way that they haven't been touched. And so I think about who from this community has done that. And you say, well, there was Elton John, the music that generations have grown up with, that they hear one of those songs and it takes them immediately to a certain place. I think of people like Larry Kramer, who is the face of fighting against HIV and AIDS. I think of Billie Jean King, who is the personification of women in sports. And it goes on and on and on and on. And then for me, it was Bayard Rustin. And he tied all of it together for me. He started in the labor movement, negotiating contracts for black laborers to work in all white unions, something that didn't happen before that. And then he moved into the civil rights movement, and he was the person behind the March on Washington, where "I Have a Dream" was said for the first time by Martin Luther King. And then he was forced out of that movement because he was a gay man. And he did some things within the LGBTQ community. But this is a guy who did all of these things without computers, without mobile phones, in his head, on a scale that was never seen before.
Wow.
With brain power that is unimaginable. And he did them. And he was brilliant. And he was black. And he was gay. And I just was in awe. And so I said, if I can find a way to help do what this man did. He never became really famous until recently when they did a film about him that got someone an Academy Award. Then I'm really contributing, because people have to know what the real workers do. This guy made sure that everybody who went on that march, that stood in front of the Lincoln Memorial, the largest such rally in American history up to that point, had a sandwich, that they had a place to go to the bathroom, that they had transportation, that there was no scrap of paper left on the mall when they finished, that there were no guns, there was no violence, that he trained the security so that they could do it without violence, without weapons. I mean, this guy is the person who taught Martin Luther King how to do things with nonviolence. He took the guns away from the people who protected the King family, because he said you can't say it and then not do it. I mean, this is a hero. And unfortunately, for too many, an unsung hero. And then through the human rights work that I was doing before, I was thrust into the world of Eleanor Roosevelt, who was a woman, admitted that as a child, she grew up in a racist, anti-Semitic environment and hated Jews and hated blacks. And she became the greatest crusader for the marginalized and the minorities, not only in the United States, but around the world. And I have in my possession somewhere here shoes, casts of shoes that belonged to Eleanor Roosevelt. And I used to take them wherever I went. And when I would speak, I'd say, you only know someone when you've walked in their shoes. And if there were ever shoes that I wanted to walk in, it would be Eleanor Roosevelt's, and I would put them out there. Wow. And people go, oh! But it's a prized possession of mine. And they were made by the person who I created the idea, the concept of the UN Decade on Human Rights Education for, who went on and got it approved unanimously by the General Assembly of the United Nations, and who I worked with closely for about 20 years. So all of it came together.
Yeah.
And so I ended up here, and I ended up here right after the governor of Florida, Ron DeSantis, passed the Don't Say Gay legislation. And so I felt that I was in the right place at the right time once again. And in the last 4 years, I have had the editorial in the Miami Herald for Pride. And that is the largest newspaper in all of Florida.
Wow.
So that I feel very happy about, that I get something in the newspaper that sets off a month where one community welcomes everybody in terms of celebrating liberation, freedom, and justice for all. It is not about one group. It is about every group, because this group is in every group.
Yeah.
So it's inviting your family, your friends, your coworkers to understand what it's like to have pride, to be filled with a good feeling about the successes of a community. And so that's a great place to be.
Wow. I've never heard it explained like that before, that this group contains all other groups, and it makes so much sense. And I think it really just sheds such a different spotlight on it, because you realize how much they're carrying, how much they've had to carry, and how lacking the recognition is just because of one of the groups that they belong to. It's interesting. I didn't know who Rustin was until when I was in high school. They opened up a high school. It's about 3 miles from my house. They named it a high school after him, but I had no idea who he was prior to that. And didn't have the extensive knowledge that you have, post that either. So I think that it is such a gift, your marriage of history with the work that you do. It's in all of the work that you do. And like the image that comes to mind is a tapestry, because it does paint a picture, and the more thread that you have to a tapestry, the more detailed that picture becomes, the
richer the fabric.
Yeah, exactly. So I love your tapestry, and I hope you keep working on it.
Well, I have no choice.
Oh, sure. You always have a choice, but I don't know. I don't know that your personality would let you walk away.
Right. It has no choice.
Now, did you have siblings growing up?
A brother and a sister. My brother died young. My sister is in New York.
Okay. Did they all catch the same fire that
Differently.
Okay.
Differently.
Yeah. I don't know how you grew up with your parents and didn't have something. But yeah, I mean, it's quite a life that you've lived. And, I won't say one way or another, because that is absolutely your right to say that it's not been a successful life, but rewarding. But I think that there is such need for people like you who are willing to be the facilitators, because, unfortunately, we all can't be at the right place at the right time to get that stroke of luck to be the Greg Pecks of the world. Or the Kelsey Grammers, as it were. So
very different.
Yeah, indeed. But yeah, so I do have a question that I ask everyone at the end of each episode, which is, through the lens of your experiences, what does compassion mean to you?
Compassion. To have compassion is to care at least about others as much as you care about yourself. It's putting the greater good before yourself. There's always something bigger than any one of us. And to be compassionate, to have compassion, is to understand what role you play where you are, and to make it better. If you make it better for everyone else, you're making it better for yourself.
Very true. I love that. Is there anything, I'm sure there's so many things we didn't hit, but is there any part of your story that you were like, I wish she had asked me about this so I could have shared that?
I think one thing that I'm excited about, I don't know how it's going to come off, but on June 1st, we open our Pride exhibit. Here.
Okay.
And last year, for the 55th anniversary of the Stonewall Uprising, we built the Stonewall Bar as it looked before the police raided.
Wow.
And now that exhibit is in Key West for another month for their Pride. And I'm very happy about that. But I realized when I was starting to build out that exhibit that if that was 55 years of Stonewall, then this year would be 55 years of Pride. And Pride is different than almost anything else because Pride happens all over the world. And in city after city after city, and in some places where it's illegal. And yet people still do it. And so I said, what can we do that will give that sense of what this means? And now we have to do it at a time when government aid doesn't exist, when corporations have withdrawn their funds, when foundations aren't returning our phone calls. And yet it's too important to ignore. So how do we do this? So we started talking to people, and people were excited and people wanted to help, but they also wanted to get paid. And so some of those companies that said yes also wanted us to come up with $250,000 or $1 million, or, well, we're just not that kind of organization that can afford that. So we've scaled back and scaled back and scaled back. But the idea of this exhibit is to create an immersive experience so that when you walk into the space, you are surrounded by screens that will take you from 1970 to 2025 in 31 different locations around the world in 15 minutes.
Wow.
With the music that was highlighted in those years. And we'll see if we can pull it off, but it's not going to be easy. But we're determined for this, in this 55th anniversary year, when so much of our community is under siege, where parts of our community are actively being targeted, that we have to remind people that Pride was a protest, that it came out of the Stonewall experience, and that what we've learned is that when there are obstacles, they can all be overcome, and we always come out stronger on the other side. And that's not only true for us, but it's true for all the liberation movements that ours was built on. We are always standing on the shoulders of the heroes that came before us. And the LGBTQ liberation movement was built on the labor movement, the civil rights movement, the women's movement, and all the other movements. And all of those people are still here. At least in memory, because of their achievements. We are a library that has the story of over 30,000 authors.
Wow.
We are an archive with millions of documents. We are a museum that puts up way too many shows every year because all of these stories need to be told. And we're a really tiny, 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 tiny staff.
I've been on your website. There's like 4 of you. So,
well, and they're not all, 2 of them are part-time. So we're, on most of this, we're one person.
Wow.
And that's why it's 7 days a week, all day and all night, to try and get this stuff done. And that's why when my family sees me, when I go home, they're surprised at what I look like.
Well, thank you for sharing that. How does the local community interact with the museum?
Well, we're not a bar. We're not the beach. So it's a struggle. There are people who are great, and there are people that if you walk down the street here would not even know that we exist.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, you're pretty close to the action, so, but not in a...
Not close enough.
Not close enough, but and also not in the way that, not in the action that everybody else is looking for, like you said, the beach and the bar. So what ways do you see, or what's helpful for you guys to, in terms of building community or building interest?
We try to find things that interest people, and we try to create our exhibits around those things. But communication is very difficult in this age. When it was just 3 television stations and 3 newspapers that captivated the world, if you got picked up, people knew.
Yeah.
Now, people, if you do underwater basket weaving, you could stay in that bubble for the rest of your life.
Sure.
And not know anything else about anything else. And so what I've noticed certainly is that whereas by now somebody would have emerged as a counterweight to what's going on in Washington, but people go up and down so quickly because it's one medium, and then it's another medium, and then it's another platform, and then another platform, and people bop up and down like whack-a-mole. And so nobody catches fire. Nobody resonates with masses. You have to have so much money.
Yes.
And so it becomes clearer, I hope, for the public to recognize the role that money plays. And why money in and of itself can be dangerous, because it's like sugar, it's like tobacco, it's like alcohol. Too much of anything is really not good for you. And even certain things in moderation are not good for you.
Yeah.
That we are largely controlled by things outside of our control. And it's so important for people to recognize it, but people don't have the time or the bandwidth to step back long enough to see things for what they are.
Yeah.
And so communication is a very difficult thing to transcend. Because even if you're in the Miami Herald, who reads the Miami Herald anymore? Even if you're in the New York Times, how do you make that story have legs so it's picked up by others? Even if you're on Rachel Maddow, I've never seen Rachel Maddow, so I only know that people talk about her. I know people talk about 60 Minutes.
Yeah.
But that's like it. What was in the New York Times, what's on Rachel Maddow, and maybe what's on Saturday Night Live in the soft opening. But there are very few other things that people repeat and repeat and repeat and repeat.
Sure.
And getting access to those things is not easy. Or to get the president of the United States to attack you on Truth Social. That also might work. But I don't even know how to do that. I don't know how to get above that line so that I would even get recognized.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. It is so difficult. And I find, we were talking before we started recording about podcasting and how many podcasts there are. And you said it seems like everybody has a podcast because, if you have a computer and a couple microphones, you can have a podcast. It is hard because there's so much noise, and not to say that, what I am doing is transcendent of noise, but I think that there are people and movements out there that are trying to still build and make connection through authentic storytelling, through authentic experience. But it's hard. You have to wade through a lot to kind of get there, and to try to keep people's attention it's like you might get in front of their face, but are they going to just keep scrolling because we can, and we do. So it is for sure an uphill battle. And I can only imagine for, where you guys sit in Florida and, in the broader context of all of these things. You're not in New York City.
Or in Hollywood, California.
Yeah. Yeah.
No, or Washington, D.C. But they're 3 places.
Yeah.
And if you're not in those 3 places, you don't get coverage. Mm-hmm. And even when we've gone to those places, and we get a little, but it's not sustainable with a little.
Right.
And so it's hard. And then I see other organizations that are in those places getting more regular coverage, and they're complaining about the fact that they're not getting traction.
Yeah.
They have access to better board members. They have access to greater wealth. They have access to media that is unsurpassed in the world, and they're having trouble. So I recognize the fact we are where we are, but we are where the fight is.
Yeah.
We are where the fight is. And it's important to move the needle here. Otherwise, it won't get moved anywhere else. And other people believe that they are the center. But it really this last war on civility started here with a governor who emulates the current president, who was the past president, who emulates people who challenged other people having human and civil rights.
Right.
And made it a campaign and has kept that campaign going. And others have picked up on it because of its success in raising money. And I hope that people will pay attention. I hope enough people will pay attention. You'll never get a majority of people to pay attention. Life is too hard. Just trying to survive is too hard. Trying to put food on the table, trying to pay the rent, trying to get to a doctor, trying is so hard. And most people struggle just to survive. And paying attention to anything other than that is just too much.
Sure.
And so you don't need the majority, but you need to get to a tipping point. It's just like Moses climbing to the mountain and Martin Luther King climbing on another mountain, and they can see into the promised land, but they don't get to go. And then I'm reminded, also a biblical story, that Noah built an ark, and it rained for 40 days and 40 nights, and the world was flooded, and everything that was on the ground was dead. And then at the end of that, there was a rainbow. And that said that it was going to be okay. Didn't say it was going to be easy, but said that it would be okay. And now we have rainbows everywhere. Someplace they don't want them, but they're there. And that rainbow is not for one group of people, but it's for the children of the rainbow who represent all of those other people. Because the children of the rainbow have walked in the shoes of all those other people. And then they found their own shoes. And so the children of the rainbow, the LGBTQ community, has, in my opinion, an obligation, a responsibility to reach out and invite people in. We know what it's like to live with people who want to divide us. So we have to be the group that decides that it's time to unite us. And you can do that under a rainbow.
Wow. Beautiful. Well, I will be certainly thinking about you in the upcoming month and wishing you nothing but success and the attention that you need and deserve. And I'll make sure this comes out in June as well, just to highlight that. But we'll link to everything in the show notes so people can follow along with what you guys are doing, even if they're not local to the area. We've got a lot of people all over the world. But see if they can follow along and be involved in what you're doing, even from afar. So
thank you.
Thank you so much for your time and your stories and your history. I'm serious. I think you should just do some lectures because I'll pay for them. You're a great storyteller. So, listening to you tell history is quite fascinating. So maybe you should start a podcast. Well, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it. I know you're very busy. And again, wishing you the best of luck.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to The Human Experience. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please subscribe, share it with your friends and family, share it on social media, and rate and review it on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. You can also support the podcast financially by going to my website, thehxpod.com, linked in the show notes, and clicking on Donate. It takes a lot of time and resources to create this podcast, so every little bit helps. Everyone has a story, and I'd love to hear yours. So be sure to check out the show notes for more information about how to stay in touch. Do good and love well.